Hello everyone, bringing you a video today looking at British Army clasp knives, and the time frame we're going to be looking at in this video is from 1905 until the 1990s. And the first knife we're going to look at is this, which is essentially made to a pattern introduced in 1905. Now, it's a three-part knife in that it has a marlin spike at the back here, you have a tin opener here, and the blade is round here. We will be looking at these in more detail with the various attachments, the various parts of the knife on show, so don't worry about that. I'm just going to do a quick run through to the camera of the timeline of these. Introduced in 1905, this is made to a slightly modified pattern which was specified in 1913, which simply specified the dimensions of the tin opener. So otherwise, this is obviously within the scope of what would have been made from 1905, but in 1913 the size of the tin opener was standardised. Otherwise the pattern stayed the same. And this would be the standard issue British Army clasp knife from 1905, obviously modified slightly in 1913, and right the way through to the end of the 1930s and the beginning of the Second World War. This particular example is dated 1937, and they were still being made in the late 1930s. The design was a very good one. It did everything that was needed of it. But during the First World War, there were some ersatz forms of this manufactured, obviously because of lack of supplies, lack of materials, and the sheer number that were needed. Some compromises in material were permitted. And we have one of those patterns here. And this dates to 1917, or the pattern date that this is made to dates to 1917. And it's the same design of knife. It's the same dimensions, the same fittings, tin opener, blade and marlin spike, but it has flat fibre grips as opposed to the more rounded horn grips of the knife we looked at just a moment ago. So there were various forms of these. You could get them with various different types of horn grip, bone grips, bone scales rather is the proper term to use. These are technically known as scales, steel scales, nickel scales, and you sometimes find materials such as steel replacing the copper for the shackle and so forth. So made to the same specification in terms of the blades that were fitted and the dimensions, but different materials were permitted in terms of scales and this ring and so forth, non-critical components. And that was a wartime expedient. I believe that the wartime patterns that permitted these divergences from the original pattern were all made obsolete in around early 1920. So that's a wartime, what's the word I'm looking for? A wartime modification to the design to permit greater manufacturing using different materials, when obviously horn might be in short supply, particularly if you're trying to make thousands and thousands of these. So this, as I say, is standard. Post-war, these become standard again and were issued right through into the very end of the 1930s, when you get the ubiquitous Second World War knife comes into production, the much smaller clasp knife, and you can see the size difference between them there. Otherwise, quite a similar design in many respects. Different shape of blade. It has I believe it's sheep's foot blade, because it has that sort of shape to the blade, almost like a hoof, the front of a hoof. But these were introduced, I believe, around 1939. Most of the examples that you see that are very early dated are 1939 dated. I've never seen a 38 dated example, so I'm assuming that's the changeover date, but if anyone has more information on that, I'd be very happy to know. Still a three-part knife, although there is an extra feature which we'll talk about in a second. The marlin spike, you have a new pattern of tin opener, which we'll look at in a minute or two, and obviously the shorter, different shape of blade there. The extra feature is you have a flat head screwdriver added to the bolster there at the end, which is a nice little feature to have. Still has the copper shackle and everything there. Still has a steel bolster. Now this is a 1940 dated example, if I remember correctly. We'll find out when we look at it in more detail. And the steel bolster would disappear during the war, I believe, or become less common. Certain manufacturers switched from using the steel bolster. It seems to be more of an early war feature. You can see obviously the earlier knives had a steel bolster as well, as you can see. But we have a couple of examples of later war knives, and this also shows another feature of the patterns that were introduced at this time. You have both a 2- and a 3-part design. So these were made, I believe, from the start in a 2- and a 3-part. The 2-part simply deletes the marlin spike. Still have the tin opener and still have the blade, but you don't have the marlin spike anymore, and you can see these both lack a steel bolster. Oh, the design, as I say, is otherwise the same. Same dimensions and so forth. The blade is the same dimensions, but this just lacks the marlin spike. And these are both dated 1943. These examples, so a bit towards the middle of the war manufacture. And this also shows, again, as I was saying earlier, they both have a steel shackle on the end there as opposed to copper. That's another change, obviously, because copper, non-ferrous metals, were a scarcity. So you can see here, this has some of these got used to death. This is how the blade should look, and this is how they are sometimes ground down. And you can see the difference in the shape there. This one's been so heavily used and so reground so many times that it's completely lost its shape. So that's two wartime examples there, and this would basically be the standard through to the early 1950s, but in both 2- and 3-part designs. In 1944, and we've talked a lot about this recently, as part of the late war jungle equipment, a steel scaled knife was introduced. The example is dated 1945. As I say, we'll have a look at all of these in more detail soon. Introduced in 1944 as part of the late war jungle equipment, obviously being part of the late war jungle equipment intended only for Far East issue or tropical issue, not a general issue item at the time. The design is basically the same. If we look at the 2-parter here, by comparison, basically the same dimensions, the same blade. This one again has been very heavily ground down, as you can see, quite roughly done as well, but it is what it is. And then obviously the tin opener on the other side. The tin opener is a bit shorter, but the design is essentially, it's designed to do the same job, and you still have the screwdriver blade at the end there. This is colloquially known as the Burma knife for obvious reasons, and these were produced in parallel with the small the small horn-handled knives through until the early 1950s. And obviously the design is intended that horn handles and so forth aren't going to do very well in a tropical climate, or that's what had been found. So over to a steel knife. In 1952, the design was modified again, or the general issue knife was brought up to that standard, and you see this design come into use, and also a 3-part version as well. Unfortunately, I don't have an example, but imagine this with a marlin spike on the back, basically. That's all you have to think of with that. 1952, these were introduced. You still have the flathead screwdriver. You have a new design of tin opener, and that's another point to mention is the tin opener was altered, and we'll have a look at these in contrast in more detail. This shape is different to those produced earlier, in that it also functions as a bottle opener as well, which earlier Second War knives didn't, but we'll get into details of that when we look at them in more detail. The blade is the same shape as before, basically. And as I say, introduced in the early 1950s, and still where they were issued right the way through the Cold War. This is the design that sets as I say, it sets the pattern for the ongoing production. As I say, you have the marlin spike on the 3-part version. There were NATO stock numbers for both, so obviously they both were in production into the beginning of the use of the NATO stock system, and that's basically what carries us through to the modern day. However, there is a modification to this design that came in the late 1990s, which I don't know if it's standard issue or if it's just a modified design that's issued to some people. Perhaps anyone who knows could let me know in the comments section. But basically, it involves the 2-part knife, which we have here, has an additional locking mechanism on the back here, so that the blade can be locked in position when it's open, which of course I don't have in my collection for obvious reasons. So there it is. As I say, this basically carried right the way through the Cold War and into the 90s, and then the slight modification was introduced. I don't know if the 2-part is the only one that's issued now with the locking blade. Perhaps, as I say, anyone who knows details of that could let me know. 2 other knives we'll just have a quick look at, not as a warning, but just as an example of things you can buy that aren't accurate, aren't actually original items, or not accurate, that's not the right term, but they aren't original items. One of which, having just looked at the steel knives, this I believe is a commercially made example. It's a copy of the 2-part design. The screwdriver is a slightly different shape, as you can see there, but it's a stainless steel copy of the issue 2-part knife. No military markings or anything on it, no date or anything like that. So as far as I'm aware, these are commercially made. Nothing wrong with buying these. They're a perfectly good clasp knife, but I don't believe these are actually military issue, although they are made very closely to the military specification. So a nice thing to buy, nice thing to have as a using knife, which is basically why I bought it. but not, as far as I'm aware, not actually a military issue item. So that's one to look at. The other one is this. And this ostensibly is made to exactly the same pattern as that made during the Second World War for the British Army, but it's a post-war Belgian knife. It's 1951 dated and marked ABL, which is Belgian manufacture, Belgian Army issue, and you can possibly get away with using one of these for reenacting if you want a using knife, though there's really nothing wrong with using the old British knives at all, and they're not hard to come by. So I would suggest avoiding buying these, and do try and avoid them. Obviously, some people sell these as British. I've even seen them with the ABL ground off. So if there's any grinding or anything on the side of the tin opener, keep an eye out. Another feature as well is this raised area between the rivets, between the pins on the scales there. As you can see, there's a raised area just there. It's another way of telling. So avoid these if you want a genuine British article. There are a lot of them are sold for reenacting purposes because they're very plentiful, but there's nothing to stop you buying a proper British one, really. They do turn up. So I would suggest avoiding these if you can. The reason I have mine is I think it came in with a job lot of stuff at some point. I think post-war, a job lot of post-war stuff that I bought, and I've just kept it because the blade's actually quite good. It's quite a sharp blade, so I occasionally use it. But as I say, if you're looking for a proper British one, don't buy one of these. So we'll have a look now at some of these in a little bit more detail.
Okay, so going back to the beginning, we'll have a look at here the design. This design first introduced in 1905 in the form you see here in terms of the blades and everything. Some sources state that the initial introduction, on initially being introduced, these had staghorn handles as opposed to the checkered grip, and that along with the tin opener was modified in 1913. The tin opener having having a standard size specified, and the checkered grips taking over from the staghorn grips that have been used previously. Some sources say otherwise, some only mention the tin opener, so I'm not entirely sure on that, but the basic design appeared in 1905. You can see here the War Department stamp on the marlin spike there, and we do also have a date on the blade. If I open this up here, there's the maker's name and everything. If I open this all the way, and hopefully it'll focus. Bring it to the camera here. There we go. And if we flip this over, you can see, hopefully you can see 1937 on the other side of the blade there. So hold that back in, have a look at the tin opener now, which is a bit stiff. So just get that out there. You can see the tin opener design and the marlin spike, which also, like the blade, pivots right the way around, as does the tin opener. You can see the copper shackle here at the end, and that's just a more detailed look at this. And then by contrast, we can bring in here one of the ersatz patterns, which I've mentioned already, and you can see the difference in the grips here. This is a pattern introduced in 1917. Basically the same knife in terms of all the fittings, but the scales are now made of a pressed fibre, flat. You can see it's flat rather than being rounded like the horn scales, and it's got this sort of shallow checkering to it. And the design essentially is a wartime expedient, as I say, just because obviously horn was not as easy to come by, and if you're making a lot of these, then you need to have a bit of flexibility in manufacture. Still have the copper shackle, but these would sometimes be replaced with steel, again as an economy measure, but it still functions in the same way. We have the marlin spike there. We have the blade here. I think the maker is on this side here. We can get that to the camera so it'll focus. There we go. Sorry, got it the wrong way up again. M. Morton and Sons, Sheffield, I think. And we'll have a look at the same design of tin opener there, as you can see. So basically the same design of knife, just with these scales fitted instead. And then of course in, I think it's late 1939, you get the smaller, and we'll just better idea of contrast of size here, as you can see between the two. We have the 1939 and the 1937 dated, of course. So late 1939, I believe, is the switchover date to the smaller clasp knife, and the more modern design of tin opener and stuff, which we'll have a look at now. So it's basically the same function. You have a tin opener blade and a marlin spike. You also have the screwdriver, the turn screw on the end there, as you can see. We'll open up the... Oh, these are all stiff despite having been oiled. And you can see the date there on the new design of tin opener 1940, and obviously a much more modern design of tin opener concurrent with the time, and the different shape of blade, which is, as I say, known, I believe, as a sheepfoot blade, because obviously the front of this is shaped somewhat like a hoof. And if we close up that and bring this all the way around, or round to here rather, because otherwise the screwdriver's in the way, we can again see the maker's name on there. If I can bring this into focus, there we go. So that's a look at the 1940 dated knife. Again, the marlin spike pivots all the way around there. You can see, I seem to have seen much use. Still have the copper shackle on this example because it's a relatively early war example. But if we move on to this 1943, I believe it's 1943 dated example, we have a steel shackle there, as you can see. That's been modified. And this, by contrast, has had the blade ground down quite heavily. If we just bring this one in here to contrast the two blades, you can see how much this has been ground down. Flip this away again. Bring this up to the camera here. I'm not sure if there are any maker's marks. I don't think there are on this one. But again, the date, I believe, is on the... there we go, on the... you can see 1943 there. And I mentioned earlier about the tin openers having a bottle opener. You can see these. We'll contrast it with the 1950s example a little bit later on. But I'll leave this out here and bring in the two-part example, which, as I remember now checked, is actually dated 1945. And we'll have a look at the tin opener first on this, and you can see the contrast here. You've had this little loop added at the bottom, a little tongue added at the bottom, which of course allows this section to be used to say bottle opener. So the tin opener now does double duty on this, and if we bring this up to the camera here, we might be able to focus. I think that's 1945. And this is obviously a feature which I believe appeared in 44, 45, initially on the quote-unquote Burma knife, the jungle knife, which we'll have a look at in a second. Let's get this blade out here again. You can see it's the sheep's foot shape of blade there, and this is obviously just a two-part example, steel shackle and everything as well, by contrast. And we'll leave those there a moment and just bring in the two-part, the Burma knife, the late war jungle knife here, is by way of contrast. Still has the screwdriver and everything, as you can see, and this also has the bottle opener type tin opener. You can see it's a bit shorter there, as I said earlier. The blade would have been very similar, but again has been ground down heavily on this one. You can see the markings here. We bring that in there, SSP 1945, and then oil the joint, which is something you see on the post-war knives as well, stamped into the steel. Close this down again. Close these down and move them to the side. Put these over here. So we can now have a look at the immediate post-war. In fact, we'll bring the jungle knife back in. Contrast the shape of the scales there. You can see this dip worked into the side of the scales there. Make it a bit easier to withdraw the bottle opener and the tin opener rather, and we'll contrast the shape here between these two, seeing as we have it here. Shouldn't have put that away really. Open it up again, and you can clearly see the design there, the change to the tin opener. So basically meaning that this does double duty without having to have the extra fitting there, just a change to the design. And you can see the markings here on this 1956, and unfortunately the spring on the back here for the tin opener in fact is broken, so that doesn't work quite as it should. It's very loose in contrast to all the others, which are quite stiff. Pull out the blade here. The blade's in very nice condition. As I say, it was cheap enough, and it is what it is. So in contrast there with the late war jungle knife. And as I say, this design would see service right the way through. It would evolve into the post-war. This would eventually have the locking mechanism added for the blade. These were also manufactured, as I say, in a three-part design. Basically, just imagine the marlin spike attached at the back there, across the back of the blade there. That's the only difference from this design of the three-parter, which I unfortunately don't have an example of yet, but I hope to pick one up at some point. So there it is.
So there we've had a quick look at the development of the British Army clasp knife through the 20th century. I hope you found that interesting, as I always say. If you like these uploads and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, looking at British military, British military history and so forth, then please do consider subscribing. And if you're newly subscribing or already subscribed, then please do hit the notification button, so you'll obviously then be notified of when I upload future videos. I also have a Facebook and an Instagram page, which I always link in the description, where I post photographs and things of the collection, sneak peeks of upcoming videos and so forth. It's also a good place, as I'm away this weekend at Hack Green. I'll be putting photographs up of the event on there as well. So if that's something that would interest you, then please check those out. And that's everything I wanted to say in this video. So until next time, bye for now.